Hey everybody, welcome back to this show, to this presentation. If you're watching on YouTube, we're going to go over the psychological types, the philosophy of the psychological types. Come at it from a philosophical perspective. Make it super exciting. I know I've talked about MBTI, Jung's typology before, but I think we're going to address it from, this philosophical perspective. Put it in its proper context. I think these things are important. MBTI, your type, it is definitely important. But let's put it in its proper context. Hey, I really like doing front raises, but is that going to be the basis for your shoulder program? No, I think you have to start doing some overhead press, some military press. Boy, what was that? 45 seconds before a weightlifting analogy? Well, get ready. Be a lot more of those. First things first, animusempire.com/schedule. Free consultations, right? 30-minute consultations. If you one of these people who go around and think that you're an introvert and that's just who you are and that explains your behavior, then I think you need to understand you need to understand your psychology from a little bit deeper perspective. Like we're going to go through types today, understand them from a deeper philosophical perspective. You need to understand yourself from a deeper emotional perspective. That would be the psychological equivalent. Again, animusempire.com/schedule, free 30-minute consultations. If I can't help you, I'm happy to point you in a direction that would be more helpful. It is going to be a step in the right direction for you. All right, overview of this presentation is context, agenda, where we're going with this. Part 2 will be an overview of the types of Jung's psychological types from 1921. Part 3 will be a philosophy of the types. Part 4, a solution to the types, a philosophical solution, and a psychological solution. And then part 5 will be takeaways, how you can use this information to use the types in an appropriate manner. Part 1, what did I say? It was context? I changed it. Part 1, agenda, where we are going in this presentation. So important thing to understand about types is they are not mutually exclusive. So the ones we're going to deal with today are thinking, feeling, sensing, intuitive, and introversion, extroversion. Now, typically, especially this is true with the MBTI, when you take that test and it says that let's say you score high in extroversion, that necessarily means you are going to be less introverted because of that. And also we're going to get to definitions of the types just to clear that up. But types are not mutually exclusive, and this isn't simply my opinion. This isn't simply how I wish it to be. This is actually based in philosophy, based in the philosophy that Jung provides in psychological types. Second point that we're going to get to is that types are adaptive. Even if you are INTP, let's say, then that doesn't mean that's who you are. That's just an adaptive mechanism. That is how you've adapted yourself to your environment to fit for whatever reason, for whatever myriad of reasons. Now, Jung goes back and forth on this. Does he think they're biological? Does he think they're adaptive? Well, again, it goes back and forth. I have several quotations here. We're probably not going to just read through the quotations, but you can read psychological types for yourself. And he kind of goes back and forth. Are the attitudes more biological versus the types? I'll leave that to you to decide. And the third point here, the third thing we're going to get to is the point that types are epistemological functions. Types stem from our epistemology more than anything else. Can you change your epistemology? Can you change the way that you view reality? How do you know what you know? Can you change that? Can you change how you know? Of course you can. These are all decisions now. Is it simple? Is it easy? There's a lot of our epistemology has become automatized in our unconscious. Yes, but that doesn't mean you can't change them. And if we really want to integrate, then individuate. Integrate our different parts of us, our different types, and individuate in that process. Then we got to see these things as the epistemological changeable functions that they are. And I just got to say, this isn't just the MBTI. I'm not criticizing the MBTI solely. I am. But I just see Jungians themselves lose all sense of, depth. I mean, Jungians claim that they're depth psychologists. The unconscious is important. But when talking about types, they lose all sense of depth. And of course, I haven't seen this because, I haven't actually been there in the clinic, but I've heard of Jungians telling people in the first session, explaining their behavior by saying, oh, you're extroverted, or oh, you're introverted, or somebody comes in and they're complaining about their mother-in-law. Oh, well, you must be extroverted because you're so concerned about something outside you. This must be your typology. What? No. What are you talking about? Again, type is good. It is definitely useful. In the fifth section, takeaways, we're going to discuss how it can be useful. But that is not a useful outlet for this. Yeah, and just to be clear here, there's two levels of wrong when it comes to Jungian typology. There's the first, the idiomatic, when somebody just says, "Oh, I'm introverted," when they mean they're shy. That's a poor definition of introversion. That is not what Jung meant. Now, maybe an introvert would be more likely to come off as shy, but introversion and shy are two completely different things with two completely different causes. So there's that idiomatic level of wrong, but then the deeper philosophical level of wrong to the psychological types, how people apply them, that's what we're going to talk about today. I just want to make this as clear as possible. If you do not understand the basis for the types and you go around saying that you're one type as opposed to another, then you really don't know who you are. I will submit that you don't really know who you are. I mean, and this could be a divergent point, so I'm not going to... But even if you have never been in therapy for any consistent length of time, delving into issues that you really need to delve into, you don't really know who you are. And I hope this is the point of not only this presentation, but Animus as a whole. Animus as a company is just to show you, just to flip your psychology upside down and say all those things that you didn't think were that important are actually the most important things, and all the things that you thought were important didn't matter. I actually have two quotations here. Paragraph 28, paragraph 38, about the differences between, whether Jung thinks that about introverts and I'm not going to read that. It's just, I think this is going to be long enough as it is. But I want to put typology in the context of the archetypes. This is the archetypes, is what I talk about. I got this from a website, but I mean, I have some disagreement with this. I mean, there you see intellect on the left side, left brain, and then intuition on the right brain. I would put knowledge and experience. These are two different kinds of decisions that you can make. It's not so much intellect and intuition. But look, to put typology in its proper context, the archetype map, as I said before, shows you where to go. That this is the map. This is showing you where you need to go to integrate, to individuate. There you see it in the middle. So if you're more of a magician, what do you need? More motherly energy. I would say confront more of your anger, or use your anger in a more assertive way, assert the anger, and start gaining some knowledge. So you go from magician to king. And as you go from magician to king, you integrate, you individuate. And all typology is how precisely you're going to go from magician to king. Okay, so the map's showing you where to go, but how are you actually going to get there? Personality is how you get there. And I do think there is one very important personality construct, and I'll put it in the context of this map towards the end of the presentation. Again, just like CBT. I always make fun of CBT, but it does have a useful place. It's not wrong, but when we take CBT, which I think is rightfully 7, maybe 8% of proper therapy, and blow it up to 100% of proper therapy, then begins to lose its footing. Same thing with Jung typology. What's your personality type? That is how you use your emotions. But I think, as we're going to see, how we use our emotions will affect our type. All right. Part 2, Psychological Types Overview. This is the original work from 1921, which is pretty early in Jung's career, I will say. And he did have some other remarks to say about typology. We're not going to get into that now. We're going to treat it as a standalone book, because he didn't really rescind too much of it, or any of it at all, really. But the outline of it is essentially this. Jung says, hey, here are some functions and I've noticed in therapy. Here are some general personality orientations I have noticed in practicing with people. Now the second part is, he says, well, they're adaptive, but partly innate. And I'm not going to be too clear about what is innate because I'm young and I do have some issues with clarity at times, although I think that criticism of Jung is mostly overblown. And then the third part is going through 500 pages of examples of how the typology affects, different parts of different areas. The philosophical areas, excuse me. So it is important to note that this is based on empirical findings from Jung's practice. I mean, Jung was first and foremost, I think we would, if we're going to put him in the typology way, we would classify him mostly as an introvert because he spent like 4 years alone and had a nervous breakdown. But I don't know, it's maybe he's more of an extrovert naturally. And I think there may be some indication there of where these types come from. He was very empirical. Now, a lot of Jungians now have completely lost this thread of Jung that, some of it is kind of woo-woo, but he was basing it all in observation. I mean, he was looking at people's dreams and saying, wait, you're having this dream, like this weird story from 700 years ago that only I've read because I'm like this incredibly well-read guy. How would you know this? You're barely literate. How are you having the same dream from this famous medieval story? He was just looking at information and putting pieces together. And that's all he was doing with types. And also I wanted to reconcile Freud's theories with Adler's. Freud's he thought were fundamentally extroverted. Adler's were introverted. We're going to put these in philosophical context for you here in a little bit. And also there's a difference between attitudes and types. And I often mess this up, but strictly speaking, the attitudes are extroversion and introversion, and there is more evidence to suggest that Jung thought the attitudes, the extroversion and introversion, were innate, as opposed to the types, thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition, which are more adaptive. Yeah, and all introversion means, just to be clear, it doesn't mean shy, it just means you're more focused on yourself. Extroverted means you're more focused on the environment, you're more outwardly oriented, as opposed to introversion, which is inwardly oriented. It has nothing to do with being shy and outgoing. Now, maybe there is some overlap between extroversion and outgoingness because you are more concerned with the existential world, but that is not precisely what's going on. And yeah, the four functions, what these are: sensing is simply looking at what is present. Intuitive, as Jung describes in paragraph 958, is looking at something and being able to tell from whence it came and where it's going. That's a direct quotation. Also, I've been listening to a lot of The Darkness, so maybe that's going to start saying whence a lot more. And then thinking is looking at meaning, the connection, making different connections between seemingly disparate ideas. That's thinking. What does this mean? And then feeling is giving something value, providing depth to the meaning. And the irrational perceiving functions are intuition and sensing. And it's not irrational because they're wrong, or how we typically think of irrational in a philosophical context. It's irrational because the contents are not used for reasoning. It's just a perceiving. Yeah, so really a better way of saying that is just perceiving functions, but Jung calls them irrational. Not irrational, just non-rational. Irrational. I think that would be a better word for them. And then the rational judging functions, thinking, feeling, and rational, not that they are inherently rational and that they inherently code reality correctly, but it's simply rational to the extent that because they organize sense perceptions. So you end up with 8 types: extroverted, introverted, provided with the 4 types, the 4 attitudes, and you get these: extroverted sensation, introverted sensation. Well, just switch sensation, intuition, thinking, feeling out with extroverted, extroverted, introverted, and you get 8 types. And also, if we're still following here, the 4 levels of the functions. So you have a principal function, auxiliary function, tertiary, and inferior. Now, the principal and the auxiliary functions are conscious, and the tertiary and inferior functions are unconscious. So even if you're highly introverted, as you would say, you still have an extroverted side. It's simply unconscious. And this may indicate, again, this belies, I think, what Jung says explicitly at times in psychological types about the biological nature of the types. So he would say if your principal function's intuitive, you could have an unconscious sensing function. I said intuitive. Then you may have an unconscious sensing function. Well, what would Jung say about individuation? I mean, just go back to the archetype map. I mean, he wouldn't put the archetype map in that way. He would have thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition, but he would say you reconcile these, you transcend yourself in a way by reconciling these four seemingly opposite functions. So in a sense, he's telling you, hey, if you're sensing or intuitive, you make the other one that is unconscious, conscious, that's psychological health. Again, just to say that, hey, maybe your type isn't really your type. It's just how you've adapted to the world. And what about judging and perceiving, which are part of the MBTI? Well, Jung doesn't really talk about these, but I would call these deductive and inductive. Deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, do you start with premises and follow from there, or do you look at facts? Are you more experiential and then group together principles based on your observations? And I think this is mostly superfluous, and there's a lot of overlap here with rationalism and centralism, which we're going to get to. All right, part 3. What are the philosophy of the types? Let's get into it. Yeah, these types did come from Jung's empirical findings, but that he wasn't just going to rely on that. And like I said, what he goes through in psychological types is about 500 pages of, let's look at examples throughout history of when these types come up and how they affect different areas of our knowledge. Like, so there's a section on poetry. There's a unfortunately there isn't a section on sexual leanings. There's a section on Oriental Eastern philosophy and how it comes up. So it's just how these types have affected our thought, not just in our civilization, but in other civilizations. Everything I just said I have here. So there's medieval philosophy, how types affect modern philosophy, aesthetics, poetry, Eastern thought. I don't want to sound like I'm being dismissive in any way here. This is really important, and I think if you really want to get into types, you got to read psychological types, because Jung gets into it. I think you'll have a different perception of psychological types coming out of it. I'm seeing how these things pop up in different areas of our thought. Okay, so let's look at introversion and how it could really simply be this philosophical orientation of realism. So what is realism? It is a metaphysical view that says only universals exist. In a sense, what this means is there are ideas without facts. The epistemology of this is rationalism. So what would be a universal? As an example, well, a pretty famous one that you use in Philosophy 101 is chair. You have an idea in your mind of what chair is. That is a universal, and it is represented in all the particulars that you see in the physical world of chair. Okay, so you have a stool. Let's say just a four-legged stool without a back. That's a chair in a sense. You have the computer chair that you're sitting in that swivels and has a mesh back. And it's on wheels. That's a chair. But in your mind, you have a conception of a chair. And this is the Greek precursor to idealism, the idea that the world is made up of predominantly ideas. In fact, everything that we see is simply a projection of our mind. And there were philosophers who took this quite literally. We're going to get into Descartes, but somebody who we're not going to discuss is Bishop Berkeley. Don't call him Berkeley. Who said that, no, everything that you see is a function of your mind projecting it out. And you'll hear a similar kind of interpretation of metaphysics in modern self-help movement, like, oh, if you think it, you can be it. Positive thinking. Then this has not exactly. I don't want to get too off topic here. You can see I'm thinking, Dominic, because I'm just making a bunch of connections here. That's going to take us all off track. But yeah, this is prevalent in Stoicism and in Christianity, and it's influenced our modern self-help movement, positive psychology, and cognitive behavioral therapy. It doesn't matter what's going on so much in the world, it's what's going on in you. Now, what comes first? The metaphysics of realism or the introversion? Well, we may get to it. But right now, I just want you to consider that these are essentially the same thing. So even if you still think that introversion is more fundamental than realism, you can at least see how if you were introverted, you would be more attracted to philosophies of realism. So what's the premise of realism is universals must be knowable. And we're going to get to this in the next section, but it would be very difficult to navigate the world treating everything that you see as inherently disconnected. So even if there are two chairs, a computer chair and a stool, well, they're really too different to categorize in the same way. So we have to treat them as two separate entities. The only reason why we have universals is for subjective convenience, nothing else anyways. But yeah, the premises of realism are universals must be knowable, and universals and particulars are too different, so they must exist in two different worlds. And these are arguments for realism from Plato. The first argument for realism is multiplicity. Yeah, there are many particulars for every one universal. There are too many manys for the one universal. They're too different. They must exist in two separate worlds. There's the argument from change. Particulars change, but universals are unchanging. I mean, you can take a chair, make it bigger, take a couple chairs, put them together, raise them up a little bit, and you have a table. You couldn't do that to a universal idea of a chair in your mind. Arguments, yeah. So then there's material versus non-material argument. Well, particulars are material and universals are non-material, two different. They must be in completely different worlds, on completely different metaphysical planes. The fourth one, one we know through reason, the universal, through our rationalism, through our rationality, which isn't the same as rationality, as we would typically think of it as today. Rationalism, as in epistemological school, is not the same. We'll get to it. The particulars we know through our senses. So these two different things, right, we know through completely different ways. Sorry about that. And then the fifth argument for realism, again, this is all from Plato, who is the arch realist. They're too different to exist in the same world. So then we have Descartes, just to give a little bit of different perspective. Descartes has two ideas essentially for realism. The idea that only universals exist, nothing, and not particulars again. And the first is the argument from the cause of the idea of God. Descartes says he has an idea of a perfect, infinite, beautiful, loving, of course, Christian God in his head. And since the cause of something must be less perfect than the effect, then Descartes says that the idea of God must have given form to this idea of God in his head. This, according to Descartes, is clear and distinct. Because he's trying to create a philosophy based on something that is irrefutable. And this is his idea of something that cannot be refuted. Going inward. What's going on inside of me, right? This is introversion. You're focused on yourself. This is very similar to, Plato's degrees of reality. And this is just another iteration of this Platonic realist metaphysics. But why would this approach be incorrect? I'll leave you to think about that, and we will get to it in another section. All right. So next we have extroversion, which is, I would submit, is just another way of saying nominalism. Well, what is nominalism? It is the metaphysical view. Whatever realism is, nominalism is the inverse of that. It is that the world is only made up of particulars. This is, in a sense, what this amounts to is facts without ideas. You can have facts in the world, but without the conception of the facts. So see the split here. You can have ideas without facts. And you can have facts without ideas. You cannot have facts with ideas. Why couldn't you have facts with ideas? Why would we split apart introversion and extroversion as being mutually exclusive? Is it based on this epistemological battle between these two outmoded schools of philosophy? That's why you think you are who you are? And a nominalist would say, yeah, we can make universals, but it's just a subjective convenience. Like, we'll talk about chair. We're going to group the computer chair and the stool. We're going to group them in the same category. We just do that for our own convenience. That's not real. That's not a reflection of reality. We're in a sense deceiving ourselves to get along in the world in a better way. This was the Greek precursor to materialism and the epistemological equivalent, which we'll get to, which is empiricism. And this is fundamentally Aristotelian in its nature. So what are some arguments for nominalism? Well, nominalism started, we'll begin there, it got its start from the Animus, mostly Democritus, and he was trying to answer Anaxagoras' dilemma. This is now pre-Socratic, now going back to ancient Greece. And the ancient Greeks, what were they trying to solve? They're trying to figure out, why is there change in multiplicity? How can one thing change into another? And how can there be many different things? Right? We cannot live in this world of many different things, because a world of many different things is fundamentally unknowable. And I think Anaximander said that the original things that we see, everything is made up of earth, wind, fire, air. But Anaxagoras said his dilemma essentially amounted to, well, there must be more than earth, wind, fire, and air, because we can't explain how earth, wind, fire, and air combine to form everything that we see. So there must be as much stuff, as much things, as many particulars as there are things. So there's a tomato particular, thing, stuff, an apple stuff. I think it's usually taught as stuff, not thing or particular. Right? There's a sweatshirt stuff, there's a skin stuff, there's a wall stuff, there's a wood stuff. Everything is a bunch of different stuffs. So nominalism began. Democritus tried to answer this. He said, well, how about this? These things are, in a sense, irreducible primaries. So let's make the stuffs into more atomic, even more fundamental stuffs than everything is a different particular, and how those fundamental things combine and interact forms the stuff that we see, which is essentially right. I mean, that's what atoms are. I mean, Democritus was positing this view that was atoms, but he didn't really see the mechanism behind it, so this ended up becoming nominalism. Yeah, so Democritus said that everything is made up of atoms, and how they combine and rearrange, form different substances. This is, in a sense, the beginning of, what we now know as nominalism, or, well, nobody's really calls himself a nominalist today. Now it's mechanistic materialism, or just materialism. I mean, this is the metaphysics of the scientific, maybe more left-leaning part of society, where realism would be the metaphysical view of the more religious, right-leaning part of society. And then there are three more arguments for nominalism. And this comes from Hobbes, which is really when nominalism became popular. And the first two are the main ones. Is, well, I can't find it. I can't experience universals. I mean, I can have an idea of it, but that doesn't make it real. So it can't really exist. The other one is the borderline case argument. A borderline case is a particular that overlaps two conceptual categories. So a common example of this is on the color spectrum. Right? There's a point between red and orange that it's like, is this red or is this orange? Well, we can't really say for sure. We can't look at this one particular and say where it falls in these two conceptual categories of red and orange. So how can we know that those conceptual categories of red or orange really exist? They don't. We just use them for our subjective convenience. And the problem of individual universals, that doesn't really matter too much. But what are the consequences of nominalism? Well, definition becomes arbitrary, and then when definitions become arbitrary, knowledge becomes arbitrary. And if we can only know what we perceive directly, then we can't form conceptions based on what we perceive, and it makes it very difficult to navigate the world with any kind of certainty. Cause and effect are, in a sense, illusions, and we saw this, most egregiously with Hume, who was really the end of empiricism as we know it before we got to Kant and modern philosophy. And he said, the only reason that we can't say for sure that the sun's going to rise the next day, right? There is no cause and effect. Like universal laws of nature, what's that? All we can say is we can predict with some certainty that the sun is going to rise the next day because it has risen every day before. But we can't know for sure that it will. So the idea here is that nominalism and realism lead us to epistemological dead ends. I mean, you can't just be Descartes thinking of your idea of a clear and distinct God and starting a complete philosophy on that. It's not a very solid foundation point. However, it is important because we do need universals. We do need conceptions to navigate the world in a knowable way. And the problem with nominalism is, the good thing about it is it at least looks at reality, but if it just stops there, then that becomes useless as well. And then you have, a lot of problem going on in academia now that has become made popular, especially in the last 10 years of, everything is just like post-structuralism, right? Everything's just a social, what's that word? Yeah, everything's just a social construct because it's not real. We can't form conceptions based on reality. All we have are these arbitrary social conventions that don't really mean anything anyways because they're, we can't really base them on reality. We can look at reality, sure, but we can't really base any sort of convention on reality. That's only from your perspective. If you ever heard anybody say that, then that is somebody being an anomalist. So here we have these two epistemological dead ends, but this is clearly what introversion and extroversion are. And then we have sensing centralism, and this is, in a sense, just the epistemology of nominalism. This is essentially a corollary of nominalism. Like if you start with centralism, then you'll end up with nominalism, and if you start with nominalism, you'll end up with centralism. Man only has power of sense perception, and that's it. We can only look at what is, not the conception of what a thing is. This is sensing. This is where we get the idea of sensing from. Now, you would never live your life this way. Even people who are, at least right now, really committed to the social constructivist view, you can't really live your life this way. But you're going to type yourself this way and say, this is who I am and this is how I am in the world based on this outmoded epistemology. So we're going on here. And then intuitive is rationalism, which is the epistemology of realism. It is reason without reality, mind without matter, ideas without experience. Particulars are deception. They are a distraction from our deeper truth. Yeah, it is the epistemology. Realism is the metaphysical. But I guess the question is, how can you be extroverted intuitive or introverted sensing? I mean, if the epistemology doesn't line up with the metaphysics, how can these two psychological principles, based on the philosophy, be lined up? Well, I think the answer is philosophically you can't be, but psychologically you can be, because you're dealing with just your relationship with yourself. So reality is less important. So you can become introverted. You can just become sensing of your own, with the focus on yourself versus the focus on the external world. Because philosophy is concerned mostly with the external world, and philosophy is concerned with your relationship with yourself, of course. And just as an aside, thinking, feeling, you originally associated these two with extroverted and introverted, respectively, excuse me. But again, I just want to say they're not mutually exclusive. You can have one without the other, and we'll get to an answer here towards the end. But it's just too big of an issue to go into now. Maybe like that's an entire presentation on itself. The epistemological philosophical roots of thinking and feeling as mutually exclusive. So I'm not going to deal with that too much here. So yeah, we're just dealing with the sensing, intuitive, introversion, extroversion. And Jung has a quotation from paragraph 723. It's not important. We're going to be going long enough as is. Okay, so part 4, what are the solutions to this? What are the solutions to these differing philosophical viewpoints? And I think if there are solutions to these philosophical viewpoints of realism versus nominalism, then on what basis can we really talk about introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuitive as real functions? Well, Aristotle was the solution, although Aristotle was predominantly an empiricist. What later became known as nominalism. He also had great solutions to nominalism, to the distinction between particulars and universals. Yes, particulars do exist, but each particular that exists is a metaphysical compound, an individual this, a matter, and a kind of thing such, or a form. This and such are separable in thought, but not reality. In a sense, we can look at what is similar between the chair and the stool, tease apart what is not important to the chair and the stool, and combine what is important, what does make fundamentally a chair, not in reality, but in thought. So universals do exist in a sense, only in our thought. That doesn't mean they're not real, like the nominalists say. That doesn't mean they're the foundations of all knowledge, like the realists say. Now you can have both. You can look at a thing and look how it's similar and how it's different from other things and create conceptions based on that, which is what we all do naturally. I mean, this is essentially common sense. We all live the world in this common sense kind of way, and I just want to bring the same kind of common sense thinking to our psychological personality types. And there's Peter Abelard, which Jung talks about in Psychological Types, and his attack on nominalism is, and by the way, this is a guy who was not exposed to Aristotle. Aristotle didn't come into the Western world until after this, or around this time, but he did not get these ideas from Aristotle. But the attack on nominalism is, in order to use words, we must first be able to think conceptually, because words are concepts. So universals must exist. Do we understand how powerful that argument is? It's a total just obliteration of nominalism. Even the word nominalism or social constructionism, however we'd say it today, you are using concepts. You're relying on concepts to exist, to make your argument that concepts don't exist. It is fundamentally refutes itself. And the attack on realism is we need to look at particulars to get universals. Or we need to induce from particulars to arrive at universals. And he actually goes into a very similar process that Aristotle talks about. So universals must be related to reality. Now, we don't really know too much about Peter Abelard. Where did he say universals exist? Was he like Aristotle and says, well, they exist even in our thought? Doesn't mean they're not real, but it also doesn't make them direct primaries of cognition. Well, we don't really know. But here we have a clear solution to the problem of universals. And it's affected philosophy. I mean, we've come out of the heavy-handed realism of the Middle Ages. We're able to figure this out. And now we probably have gone too far on the empiricism side, but we're at least able of grasping both empiricism and rationalism, or realism and nominalism. So let's just do the same with particulars, especially since it seems like, let's just do the same with psychological types, especially since our modern conception of the psychological types is ultimately based on this epistemology in the first place. Nominalists and realists. So this is Peter Abelard continued. Can't figure out how universals form in mind. Nominalists have no idea, so they claim universals don't exist. Realists have no idea, so they claim God put them there. And this is right from my notes on philosophy. Yeah, he was the first person to plot the sequence of knowledge from sensation to perception to conception, then to intuition. Okay. And another solution to this is induction. The process of passing in thought from particulars to general principles. This is similar to the perceiving function, not as in intuitive, but in the MBTI, the perceiving versus judging. Ultimate source of all of our general principles is looking at the world for what it is. Now, Greeks, through Aristotle, had a primitive concept of induction, where the modernity is the scientific method. That is our form of induction, looking at what's going on in the world and developing general principles based on that. Now, it's strangely becoming more and more popular to, criticize science, but overall, it has provided great general principles based on observation that we can use for living. I mean, our entire freaking world is based on science. It's based on applied physics. So even though it can be wrong, we look at especially the modern replication crisis in psychology, but psychology is not a science, right? That's philosophy, so it's not a good example. Yeah, but Aristotle's point about induction was, well, just kind of generalize out principles and then test them with reality. So this constant process of induction and deduction, which, I mean, it's essentially a guess and check, which is the hillbilly version of induction, but pretty good. Anyways, the point is that there's philosophical ways out of this. And like I was mentioned before, Jung has an implicit solution to this. Each expression, each attitude, each type can be both conscious or unconscious, primary, principal, auxiliary, tertiary, repressed, or inferior, I think. And just him saying this indicates that he didn't think these types are necessarily permanent. Yeah, what's the point of therapy? According to Jung, right? It's to make the unconscious conscious. Okay, so you have to have a type. If you have an attitude that is unconscious, your way to individuation, your suffering on the cross, so to speak, is to make that unconscious attitude type conscious. All right, part 5, the takeaways. What are the psychological takeaways from this? Or what can we learn? Knowing that our introversion, sensing, intuition, extroversion are based on these outmoded philosophical principles. In a sense, dark age philosophy. To see this split between ideas and facts, between the real world and truth. Well, if we look at type as primary, as causing these epistemological functions, then it leads to an infinite regress or reaffirmation through denial. If types come first and interfere necessarily with our relationship with reality, in a sense, if we have this inherent psychological, biological type that changes the way we view the world, literally, that changes our epistemology, then how can we know that type doesn't come from that? So how can we be sure about types? I mean, this is the problem of infinite regress, reaffirmation through denial, just reflections of the same thing. We don't. So it can't come from type. Epistemology, needs to come first, but really what comes first is our decision on what epistemology to use. Without that, psychology, without that, philosophy becomes irrelevant. And I don't mean we have 100% free will, but we need to allow some room for some free will to be exercised. And the foundation of that must be our relationship with reality. If something gets in the way, like our typology, then I can say your typology gets in the way of seeing that typology is really the thing getting in the way. I just use the same trick on you. this is really important, is that types, even the attitudes, are not primary. Now, maybe they're secondary, maybe they're tertiary, but they're definitely not primary. And going around putting your MBTI in your Twitter bio or on your Facebook page, that's who you've adapted yourself to be. I don't know who you really are. I don't think you have an official type. I do think some parts of your personality are biological. And I'll get to one construct that I think is the most important one. It's not even the big five. It's one of the big fives. And if you're a Animus Air OG listener, then you know where I'm going there. But it is not primary. You got to do the emotional work first. Why are you introverted? Why do you turn in on yourself? There may be a really good reason to do that. Or it may be because you're shy and have anxiety and you're afraid of people. Who knows? Can you guys hear the weed whacker out there? There's a weed whacker, some ambient music for the podcast. Then we have extroversion and introversion may simply be symptoms. You know, it's interesting. How can extroversion and introversion lead to two different types of people when the same cause can lead to both? Maybe you're an extrovert, or you look like a, quote, extrovert because you're afraid of being alone. Or maybe you're an introvert because you're afraid of being around people. Well, the same problem causes both. It's the fear. I mean, this is a hypothetical example, but just the fact that I can come up with a hypothetical example that shows how extroversion and introversion have the same cause shows that extroversion and introversion cannot be fundamental. So why are you sensing? Why are you intuitive? Why do you rely on thinking? Why do you rely on feeling? Why? And the answer to this is only going to come from going into the clinic and doing the emotional work, really figuring out where your actions are coming from at an emotional level. And then maybe from there you can come to some idea what your type may tend to be. But to hold it up as some kind of metaphysical truth about you is extremely limiting. So sensing, intuition, these two ways of dealing with reality, these are epistemological orientations, which must be a choice, as I said before, about the infinite regress. Because if you say that the sensing and intuition are not a choice in biological, then how can I say that your sensing or intuition isn't the actual faculty saying that? Leads to the infinite regress. Again, another takeaway, I think this is probably the most important one, is MBTI is a starting point. It is not the end point. You know how you use your MBTI correctly is you take your archetype, you take your MBTI, write out the opposite. So I typically register as ENTP. I would go ISFJ. And that would be where I go. I would incorporate those types, those personality types, to get to where I want on the map of the archetypes. That would lead me to a more effective individuation. And even if it is biological, like even if the types or the attitudes, even if they are biological, you're still going to grow way more. I mean, which they're not biological, but even if they are, you're still going to grow way more than you would if you just said, well, I'm an ENTP. That's just how I'm going to deal with the world. And so we come here. Take your psychological type, however it reads on the MBTI scale, or the MBTI measurement, and you figure out how to navigate this map in the with the personality, with the opposite personality that you present. Now, what's the one personality trait that may exist in reality? And how do we relate it to this map? It's neuroticism. It is neuroticism. It is whether you, to the extent to which you avoid problems and the extent to which you confront problems. If I was going to link neuroticism in this analogy about the car traveling around the map, neuroticism having a highly neurotic nature is like an F1 car. An F1 car that's difficult to build and put together, but once you can build it, once you do put it together and it gets going, then it can go really fast. However, Once you're going really fast, it's much easier to crash. Having low neuroticism is like having a checker cab. Well, a checker cab that doesn't break down all the time. But what comes first? Your anger and anxiety. And this is really, these two maps, this is really the solution to thinking and feeling. Because these maps, I think if we understand emotions for what they really are, as I do in these anger and anxiety maps, this will demand what? This demands your extroversion and introversion. Because what do you have to do to manage anger? Well, first you got to look in. Got to figure out what you're avoiding, what needs you are avoiding. So that's introversion, right? Looking in for some kind of truth to go to the realism, rationalism. But you use that. You don't just stop there. You use that out in the world by asserting it. That would be extroversion. And of course, this unifies sensing and intuition, because in order to get at your sadness, you first have to feel it. I emphasize over and over again, you got to feel the sadness in order to bring it up into conscious awareness. As you see here, that this is becoming aware of it. That's this arrow here. List out your needs. Feel the affect of it. Really feel the sadness. And when you feel the sadness and understand what your needs are, then you become angry, giving yourself that essential emotional tool for getting your needs met, the anger. And of course, this links up judging, thinking and feeling. We're thinking about the emotions, and our feeling of the emotion allows us to think about it more. That's what I just went through in the avoidance and awareness. Or when you find yourself destructive over here in hostility. Okay, you're feeling this, but allowing yourself to think about the hostility as you're going through it makes you feel it more. And once you know how the anger works, then you go, okay, I got to take responsibility to come back to the anger so I can get my needs met and receive the boon, the motherly energy of getting my needs met, of asserting my anger, which is compassion. And then judging and perceiving. I mean, that fits in here too, of course, because you have to use both induction and deduction to work your way through the anger map. I mean, the inductive perceiving part of this would be, again, just another way of saying, looking at the sadness, looking at how it's making you feel. And then the judging will be, okay, now that I feel this, what do I need to do? What do I need to put in place in my life? What kind of routine do I need to create for my life so I can create this kind of life where I can consistently get my needs met? So I think ultimately the personality is unified, becomes unified once we start looking at emotions in a proper context. Another indication that the personality is secondary to the emotions. Well, and of course, what comes before even emotions is reality. Of course. And again, I could say the same thing about anxiety, and we'll leave it there. I hope this is helpful. I hope you can use your MBTI in a much more useful way instead of going around and saying what you are. You go around and say what you need to integrate, to individuate, to make the unconscious conscious. If you have any questions, animus@animusempire.com. If you need to schedule a free consultation, see if I can help you or at least point you in the right direction, animusempire.com/schedule. All right, and I'll leave it there. Thank you guys for listening, and I wish you, of course, all the joy and all the pain that comes from looking at your personality for what it really is.